Hello everyone, welcome. So lovely to see you here today. Thank you for coming on quite a chilly evening actually. I thought it was quite nice earlier than somehow got a bit chill as we were walking here. So thank you for coming and joining us. I am delighted to be here with Paris Marx. We've been Twitter friends for a while. It's so nice to meet you in person. Some staff that on Twitter side is not necessarily making as many Twitter friends as I have in years. Oh, you need to be closer to the recording.
Is it on?
Is it on?
Hello?
Yes, it's on now.
Is it working? Okay, there we go.
I thought it was one of those things where it wasn't actually to amplify, it was just for the recording, but I guess, no. Okay, so if you're not already familiar with Paris, a little intro. Paris is a Canadian technology writer whose work has been published by NBC News, CBC News, Jacobin, Tribune, and a million others from what I can gather. And you're also, of course, the host of the podcast Tech Won't Save Us. If you haven't listened to Tech Won't Save Us, what are you doing in your life? No, go listen to it. It's really brilliant. And Paris has some amazing guests on there. And I think it's a really wonderful way of being able to dip into the world of tech criticism without necessarily being on yourself. If you don't know who I am, very briefly, my name is Gemma. I'm a writer and researcher. I'm actually based here at the University of Edinburgh. I'm doing a part-time PhD, also based over at the University of Glasgow. So loving Glasgow. Glasgow's awesome. And I'm also a writer, podcaster, and all that jazz as well. And we're here tonight to, of course, talk about Road to Nowhere, which is, I think, a really stunning book, actually.
Thank you.
I'm obviously going to say that, but no, genuinely, I think this is a really brilliant summary of the history and the ideas around transport, basically. And I think what you do really lovely and in a really kind of succinct way is to be able to take apart quite complicated ideas, arguments, and ideologies and genuinely put forward a vision for the future, which I think is quite hard to do in quite a complex way. So for anyone who's read the book, hopefully you agree with me, maybe you don't, and we have a chance to ask questions and then see if that's the case later on. Before that, I'm going to indulge myself asking my own questions of Paris. But let's kind of just dive straight in, because I think, you know, if people want to know the crux of the book, they can read it themselves, and I suppose it's relatively self-explanatory. But what I was saying to you earlier, one of the things that I find really brilliant about Road to Nowhere that a lot of tech books don't tend to do is really indulges in the history. And it uses history not just as isn't this an interesting story about the tech, but rather uses it to kind of make the point that this is not new and this is why things are the way they are. And actually, if we want to move forward, we have to be able to look at history and have to be able to contextualize. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you chose to do that, where that comes from, and I suppose what your kind of ideas are in terms of tech criticism and the use or the lack of use of history when we're talking about these things.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much again, of course. And for all of you for coming out in Lighthouse Books and the staff here, of course, for putting this together. It's such an interesting question, right? Because I feel like when we talk about technology, when we talk about the tech industry, when we talk about Silicon Valley, there's often a desire not to talk about the history, right? Not to focus on, you know, what happened before, where we were before now, ideas about technology that existed before, you know, the advent of the internet, basically. And I think that by not focusing on that, by not knowing that history, by not returning to that history, we miss a lot, right? And it kind of leaves us open to falling for a lot of the ideas and narratives that a lot of these tech companies put out there, right? Because they don't want us to know the history, because that works very well for them, for their business models, for getting us to buy into their ideas of the future for technology, or, you know, for many things, right? And so in a lot of my work, when I think about technology, whether it's in the book or whether it's on the podcast, having that historical lens is so important, right? Because it really gives us an insight into what these tech companies are proposing. It allows us to think critically about them. And it also allows us to say, you know, you're proposing these things right now, but if we look at the history, we can see that similar things have been proposed in the past, and all of the really nice things that you're saying are going to come out of this, you know, how it's going to improve society, or, you know, make things more democratic, or what have you. A lot of those promises have been made in the past about previous technologies or similar technologies even, and have not followed through. You know, it's not been delivered, because often, when we look at technology or when we seek technology to be the means through which we solve these problems, we get disappointed because the problem is inherently not a technological problem. It's often a political problem, an economic problem, something like that, right? So that's why I think history is so important when we think about technology.
I wonder if you could tell us what your favorite. I mean, there's so many things I wrote down. And I was like, I did not know that. That is crazy. And I think those penny drop moments are important for allowing you to open the door to criticism, something like that. What's your sort of perhaps favorite example of transport history and kind of how that made you reconsider some of the ideas that have been thrown around today?
Yeah, there are so many, right? The one that comes to mind for me was reading about how in the 1920s, the automobile is still very new in that moment. It has been rolling out slowly for a couple of decades, but it very much has not kind of taken over society in the way that it has today, right? It's not ever present. The car isn't everywhere, but there's still ideas about what the car can be in the future, or how technology is going to alter it in the future. And in the 1920s, in American cities, there's a car that is kind of being shown to the public that they called the Phantom Auto. And it was an autonomous car, right? It was going to drive itself. And it looked like, there was no driver behind the wheel because it was remote controlled from somewhere else, right? There wasn't a computer that was driving the car. There was someone somewhere else who was directing where it would go. But, audiences in cities around the United States were kind of shocked in seeing this car kind of propel itself. And, it was very new to them. And then, you think about kind of the discourses around autonomous vehicles in the past, decade and a half that we've really had about how they were going to upend the transport system, completely change like how we get around, and how that has not been delivered. And then we look back at the past and see how many times like a similar vision has been put forward and not arrived at. I don't know, it's fascinating to me.
I'll tell you what my favorite one from the book was, although it's actually kind of shocking when you think about it. It was around the mums of children who had been killed by motor vehicles when they were relatively new, and it was a kind of new thing that a car would kill somebody. And they were, you said they were thought of as the fighter gold star mums, kind of similar to your child going off to war and dying at the hands of the Nazis or whatever, because it was so shocking. And this idea of losing a child to a car, and in school they would read out the names of the children who died by a car. And it's again coming back to that point of looking back to somehow be shocked as to the current world we have. I mean, yeah, you talked a lot about the normalization of the dangers of cars, and it sounds like such an obvious thing to say, but putting it through this kind of idea of the mum being valorized as this kind of widow, almost a war widow or something, because the child had been killed by a car. I think it showcases the society we live in now, that why aren't we doing that still? Why aren't we ringing the bell? What was it, 8 times twice a day, every day someone dies by a car? And I'm wondering, what do you think about how we can try and, I don't want to say shock people into really critically thinking about the reality of our world right now, but how do you think about examples or narratives or way we can talk about transport as it currently exists to showcase how terrible it really is?
Yeah, that's a big question. And your example from the past was much more grim than mine. Mine was more fun. But it's important, right? And going back and reading that history was fascinating for me, like exploring the opposition that existed to the automobile and how, we think today about how, the car is kind of everywhere. It's very much normalized in our society. The idea that people need this to get around should be reliant on it, that you might even have communities where you can't get around in any other way, realistically, right? And just to see the degree to which we've kind of accepted the car kind of taking over our roads, our transport system in this kind of way. And then going back to whether it's, the 1910s and 1920s when what you're talking about is taking place, or the 1970s when there's a lot of opposition in Europe and the United States as well to the car and kind of its continued expansion. And it really kind of forces us to think about the system that we've created, right? And how we've allowed the car to take over and become dominant, and and to ask, why were people then so aware of how it was transforming their lives, how it was affecting them. And then today we just kind of accept, this degree of death that comes with the car, the kind of inconvenience of having to rely on it, the costs of having to own a car and things like that, for our whole lives, really. We've been fed kind of propaganda, we've been fed advertising to tell us that this is what we should expect, that this is how we should get around. But in that moment, they didn't have that, right? The car had arrived, it was completely new, and it was really transforming their lives, the way that they got around. And in particular, in that moment in the 1920s, the car was still an object for the upper classes, right? It wasn't something for the working class. And yet it was the working class who was primarily feeling the effects of it, right? As young women, as children were being killed in kind of record numbers that was not really experienced before. And so this really forced them to wake up to that, right? To notice it and to try to draw other people's attention to the fact that this was happening, and to kind of, radicalize people maybe against the car in a certain sense. Because in that moment, there was really kind of a fight, right, between these people who saw how the car was affecting them and how they didn't want it to take over because they knew that the effects would only grow. They didn't want the streets to be kind of remade for the car. And, this set of commercial interests, the automakers, the suppliers to the automakers, the oil companies, and on, who saw that they could profit immensely if this system was able to grow, if, the public became reliant on cars. And ultimately, we know that they're the ones who won out, right, and kind of remade how we get around. And so it is a question as to, how we force people to reckon with that today, how we force people to realize kind of the trade-off that we've accepted, and to question the system that we have. I think that slowly that is happening, right? I think that there's a growing kind of dissatisfaction with the transport system as it exists, with society as it's constructed. And I think we can see that in many different areas, in many different ways. But most of all, I think that the tech industry's ideas for transportation were very much a response to this, right? It's a recognition that people are not happy that so many people are dying, that people are not happy being stuck in traffic for so long, that people are not happy with, the contribution to climate change being made by cars in the transport system. And they were saying, we can fix this, but you don't need to pay attention to the politics of this question, the politics of transportation. We just need to pay attention to the technology of transportation. And if we can create some new technologies, then we'll solve these problems without having to have the difficult kind of political conversations. And, the book argues that didn't happen, that didn't work.
So let's dive into that a little bit, because, this event was Marx that is talking about Silicon Valley ideology. And obviously the book has obviously got this here, what Silicon Valley gets wrong about the future of transportation. So let me just ask that question: what does Silicon Valley get wrong about the future of transportation?
So much, yeah.
In a nutshell.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I did write 200 odd pages about it. But it's fascinating, right? And when we think about, as I was talking about with the tech industry, there's very much a focus on technology, right? That technology is the means through which we solve the social, the economic problems that exist in our societies, the political problems even, right? We cannot solve these things unless technology continues to progress, continues to get better, or else then, things are just going to stay the way that they are, right? There's a real desire not to look at the politics of these problems, the reasons why they became problems in the first place, but rather to say, everything that we can think of as being a problem is ultimately a technological problem. And if we can just create better technologies, then we're going to solve this, right? And so when we look specifically at what they have proposed, what they've done in the transport system, you very much see that focus on the technology as being the route through which we solve these problems, but also a real kind of preoccupation with particular problems that face them, right? In many cases, they are focused on individualized transportation as being the means through which, we solve these problems, or what we, kind of chart the future of transport being. That very much meaning that we continue to stay in our own individualized automobiles, and that is the way that we solve these problems, right? We don't need buses, we don't need subways, metros, whatever. Just stay in a car, but we'll change that car in ways that will solve these problems. And in particular, they're focused on traffic, right? They're focused on the time that people spend stuck in traffic, because that is, kind of the one thing that the rich can escape in the transport system. You know, the poorest person and the richest person can be right next to each other on the motorway, and none of them are going any faster because, you know, they're all kind of stuck there together. And you can really see this with Elon Musk. You know, some of the ideas he's had around transportation. He even tweeted like directly while he was stuck in traffic, trying to think about how he's going to solve these things. And so fundamentally, if we're thinking about a focus on traffic, that's often not dealing with the fundamental problems that exist in the transport system that affect, you know, most people. Certainly most people are stuck in traffic many of the time, whether they're in a car or they're on a bus or something like that. Traffic will get in the way, but there's also affordability issues. There's also access issues. There's also, of course, the issue with road death and how that disproportionately affects often lower income people, marginalized people, right? There are many other problems in the system that, you know, they might kind of pay lip service to, but ultimately their solutions are not directed at really taking on.
One of the other there's many ideologies, I suppose, that you look at in here, but one of them that comes through in the book quite a lot, which links to what you're saying, is this focus on freedom. And you can see this, I've completely forgotten the name of the book now, but it came out, I think just 2 years ago, and it was all focused on the car being the route to freedom. It's written by Matthew, the guy who wrote Ideas Beyond Your Head. I forgot his name. Anyone can remember it? But it was a book basically about how cars give you freedom and how the sort of ideology of cars is can't be separated from the ideology of freedom. And he was sort of pro this, I suppose, is the best way of putting it. And I think when we're thinking about change and when you're trying to critique the sort of positive futures and visions that are put forward by Silicon Valley, I think sometimes what you have to kind of take a step beyond is not the sort of wouldn't this be better, but rather what is it they're actually trying to say. And I think where you so beautifully do this in this book is that you bring it back to this idea of freedom, individualization, privacy above all, and thinking about the idea that, well, if we only think of transport as being a thing that's meant to give you freedom, that's meant to give you privacy, then we're never going to be able to have imaginative ideas about the future of transport. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and about what does it mean to sort of challenge this arguably quite conservative and quite limited vision that Silicon Valley has of transport.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And Andre Gorse, when he wrote about this, I think it was back in the 70s, basically talked about the car being, you know, kind of an integral part of like a bourgeois ideology, right? Which is really interesting to kind of read about and think about, because if you think about the effect that the car has and how it makes you kind of think about how it's going to empower you as an individual, kind of shape how you as an individual get around, it very much has this effect, right? You know, the kind of freedom aspect of it is around from the very beginning, really, or you know, the early kind of period of when the car kind of emerges. And it's about, you know, allowing you to go faster than everyone else, allowing you to go to places that other people can't reach because they don't have the same degree of kind of access to transportation in the same way. That kind of separates you from needing to rely on a streetcar or something like that as existed at the time when these were emerging. I think it's really fascinating to me as well to look at the linkages between, you know, the automobile and the tech industry, right? The automobile very much has this kind of argument that it's going to empower you as an individual. You as an individual will be able to decide where you're going to go because it empowers you in this way. And then when the personal computer is emerging in the 1970s, 1980s, this is explicitly used by Apple as a means through which to promote the personal computer, right? The old mainframe computer was empowering, you know, the corporate hierarchies, but now we have the personal computer, and like the Volkswagen, it is going to empower you as an individual, right? And you'll be able to push back against these kind of structural forces. But then when we actually think about, you know, the degree to which the car actually offers freedom, you know, it's a difficult one, right? Because certainly it does allow you to get places, especially at a moment when, you know, in North America, which is the case that I'm most familiar with, of course, you know, there's been a massive disinvestment in public transportation, in the rail network, things like that for many decades to ensure that, you know, if you want to get around, you can basically only do so with a car. And so then that lends to this argument that, okay, the car is freedom because that's the only way you get around, even though you could get around in a very different way. We could think about freedom in a very different way, but we've chosen not to. And it's much more difficult to get people to think about that when the investments aren't there, when kind of the tangible alternatives aren't there for people to see. But then when you think about the car as a form of freedom, there are all these costs that are associated with it, right? Whether it's kind of the indirect non-financial costs where you're stuck in traffic for a long time, you're losing hours, days of your life, a year stuck in traffic with everyone else. There's kind of the threats to your life that come as a result of it. But then there are also the costs of owning the car, which can be very expensive, especially for someone on a lower income, especially if they live in a place that requires them to own a car. They can't get around in another way, or at least not feasibly, right? Then there's the maintenance, there's the insurance, there's the fueling it up with gas, there are the other costs that come along with it. And that can make up a huge chunk of your income. And so then, if you're on a lower wage, if you're trying to, get to your job, if you're trying to progress in your life, that's a huge burden, especially when you think about rising housing prices and things like that as well. So the notion that the car is freedom, I think is very hard to sustain when you actually kind of bring it into
it was linked to this point about visions as well. So I was struck by that point when you were talking about in the book how the car, you're restricted by freedom because it pulls you into many different other kinds of capitalist systems. I mean, for example, just fuel costs, right? It's pulling you into the oil and gas market world, right? But sort of against your will to a degree. And I'm curious about what you think about how the power of visions. And for context, I write and think about hype. So, in the way I kind of think about why hype can be problematic is that hype can be used to create conditions for things to happen. So it's not necessarily about saying this thing is brilliant, it's about getting people to buy into an idea so they take action. So in the case of cars, you could say, well, we're going to have cars, it's the 1950s, aren't cars going to be great? And this is something we should care about. And then suddenly there are people investing in roads, for instance, and you see it with electric cars, people are investing in charging points because of the hype for cars. And so there's obviously this sort of creationist, or whatever you want to call it, vibe to tech visions or tech Silicon Valley billionaire visions. And again, I would love to hear a little bit about, because you have a whole chapter on this sort of ideology of Silicon Valley more broadly, and where that comes from, what it's sort of centered on. And particularly given the current news around what's been happening around tech visions, you've got all the coverage of the long-termist people and SBF, the crash of crypto, the questioning around speculation, Twitter, let's just say that. I think there's obviously a lot more critique around what these visions are doing and where they come from. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about it with respect to technology, with transport, but maybe a little bit about what you feel tech visions are doing right this second, when you do have a bit more of a critical vibe going on.
Absolutely. And it's so important, right? Because the visions often are what get us to buy into these ideas, right? To get us to kind of drop our kind of critical thinking and to believe that there's this kind of science fictional future that's just awaiting us in a few years if we let these tech companies do whatever it is they want to do. It's fascinating too to think that yes, these tech companies, these Silicon Valley companies have used visions in a really effective way. But you go back to the early days of the automobile, and the auto companies are doing the very same thing, right? I start the book by talking about the 1939 World's Fair in New York, where General Motors has a big exhibition where they are trying to lay out the future of what this kind of automotive society is going to be, right? And there's wide roads and kind of tall buildings where everyone lives. There's specific pedestrian architecture. When you leave the city, there are highways with little sensors in them that are supposed to guide the vehicles and take them to where they're supposed to go. Again, another vision of autonomous vehicles that never arrived. And so they had this really clear vision or kind of hopeful vision of what the automotive city was going to be, which was based on an earlier idea for the Shell city of the future. The same guy who designed the Shell vision designed the GM vision, and then later went on to talk to President Roosevelt to influence policy around transportation. And so people were really kind of absorbed into this vision, and it shaped the way that even policymakers thought about transport and policy and all these sorts of things. And now we live with the kind of consequences of those visions and of those decisions many decades on. And so the tech industry, of course, is expert in public relations, in kind of shaping the way that we think about the future, because that's ultimately in part what they're trying to sell us on, their visions of the future, how they are going to deliver it. And of course, as I discussed in the book, and as you're saying, as we're seeing right now, these visions have tended not to play out as they have promised them to us, right? Obviously, I go through many examples of transport visions in the book, whether it's autonomous vehicles or ride-hailing services or flying cars or boring company tunnels or hyperloops. There are endless ways that they promised they were going to upend the transport system, to make transportation better, to improve the means through which we get around. And they have not delivered on those things. And the rare times that they have been able to deliver, like Uber and Lyft, for example, the benefits that were promised of those kind of services never materialized. And actually, they made traffic worse. They increased emissions. They took people away from public transport services, all these sorts of things, right? Not to mention what they did to workers' rights in the meantime. And now we're also at this moment where, especially after a decade and a half of this kind of exuberance, because the tech industry was so key to the post-2008 recovery and how we were going to, create jobs and grow the economy once again. So we needed to kind of, not think critically about what these tech companies were proposing. That now, as interest rates rise, as the cheap money that kind of fueled that boom and that speculation dries up, we're seeing even more that more of these visions that were supposed to transform society are not going to be realized, whether it's, drone deliveries that were going to be everywhere that companies are now pulling back on, whether it's, of course, the cryptocurrencies and many other things that these tech companies promised us were going to upend society, revolutionize society. If they still exist, we're finding that they're increasingly fitting into kind of structures that already existed before and just kind of tweaking them in smaller ways. But the revolutionary potential is not there because, again, the technology is not what delivers these transformations. It's the politics and things like that. And, that doesn't come along with these kind of corporate technologies from these companies.
Yeah. Can I ask you one more question and then we'll go to audience, because I can imagine you'll have lots of things you want to ask and I don't want to hog Paris in front of you all.
Sorry, I'm speaking for too long as well.
No, it's all, this is what we're here for. So kind of building on what you just said there, two things that I suppose I think a lot about with respect to Silicon Valley visions, tech and science. One with respect to the word imagination and one with respect to the word optimism. I think that sometimes being a tech visionary, for lack of a better word, there's associations with you being an optimist and there's associations with you being highly imaginative. And I would argue that you're neither, because I think that there's actually a severe lack of imagination if you only think tech is the answer, or you don't consider what things exist already in our toolkit to make change. And I think that it's a pessimistic stance to take if you say that tech will save us, because you're saying that we don't have any other way to do it. And so one of the things that I really like about how you end the book, no spoilers, but it's kind of obvious, is that you put forward quite tangible and really compelling ideas and visions and prompt imagination. And one specific thing that I read and I thought, oh, well, yeah, absolutely, this is optimistic, this is imaginative. You spoke about bus drivers and how they have the capacity to have care roles in society, in the sense that they, I know for a fact in Scotland, that's not going to live in London, but if I want a bus driver to drive a little bit further so I'm closer to my next connection or I'm closer to my house, the bus driver will do it. Because it's late at night, you're going to leave a woman and to walk a little bit further, I lived in the country as a kid and I got a bus to school and we all knew the bus driver and so on and so forth. And that was really compelling vision of like, what do we actually mean when we're talking about transport? What do we actually mean when we're saying we want to go from A to B in society? And, a bus driver acting as a care it has nothing to do with technology whatsoever. So I wonder if you could kind of briefly share with everyone, for anyone who hasn't read the book, although you should if you haven't, and just buy it also because you want to support Paris. and his culture. But kind of summarize a little bit. What is your vision? How do you move forward from the state of things, and how do you use optimism and imagination in different kind of ways that aren't so associated with tech visions?
Yeah, I think it's a very good example that you give as well, right? Because often when these companies talk about autonomous vehicles or autonomous driving and how they were going to kind of transform things and take things over, they didn't consider the other roles that a lot of these workers serve, right? That the bus driver isn't just there to drive a bus, but they also do other things, right? That, you know, a truck driver, for example, is not just there to drive the truck, but they also serve other roles in, you know, in their job, basically, right? And there are many other examples of that. And you know, it's kind of frustrating then to think about how these people are treated as imaginaries, right? Like they're dreaming of the future when actually their visions of what the future should look like are so limited, right? And are so kind of lacking the consideration of how society actually works, how you improve a human society, you know, how you engage with these other systems, because they're so focused on, as we were talking about, you know, optimization and how, you know, you improve society for particular business models and particular understandings of how it should work, right? That we need to take away this human interaction and replace it with a screen or some kind of technology, instead of trying to further promote these human interactions that people have. And I think it's so interesting that you make that comment about the end of the book and where I'm trying to lay out these ideas, because I've also had other comments that say, you know, this is too social democratic of a vision, like you should be going further. And I was like, well, maybe I'm still somewhat limited as well, right? Because I think that one of the things that defines this moment is that our imaginations are somewhat limited by the system as it exists, and in particular by these people who put out their visions for the future that the media kind of rallies around and promotes as our future. And then that makes it tougher for us to think about, well, how could things work differently? Like, does that have to be the future? Is that the desirable future for us, you know, for us to go colonize space or whatever other things that they're putting out there? You know, how can we actually think of a future that's better for, you know, people generally in society who are not billionaires? And how do we do those things? So, you know, some of the ideas that I put forward in the book are quite obvious, it seems, right?
Just to react to that, yeah, that's the beauty of, that's why I think it's wonderful. You're not saying, you know, fully automated luxury communism, but for transport. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, people agree with it, whatever, but I think there's something really imaginative and actually quite radical in saying, why don't we just invest in public transport? You know, and here's a book that tells you why we're not doing that. What are the other forces that are there that haven't allowed us to do that in the past, or have actively stopped that, and so on and so forth, to try and rally a bit of support for yeah, quite a simple idea. But I mean, you're also making the point in the book that when you do come up with these wacky ideas for how we can change road transport, often that isn't actually what's needed. So I think that you have quite a practical approach, which I wasn't expecting. I thought it would be more radical. But I enjoyed that. I'm gonna
if I could just make one point on that. Like, I think it's really interesting, because the point that I always try to make, whether it's talking about climate change or transportation or whatever else, is often that, you know, we can create new technologies, we can invent new technologies that will improve society, right? But really, we already have all the technologies we need to solve many of the problems that we're faced with, whether it's in transport, whether it's addressing the climate crisis. Yes, we can make use of new technologies if they're developed and they're useful, but ultimately they're not the core of solving that problem, right? The problem is inherently political, it's inherently social, it's inherently economic, it's not inherently technological in many cases. And so we can address these problems if we have the kind of political will to do so. And sure, we can use technologies, we can not, whatever, but that shouldn't be the focus of how we try to solve these things.
Yeah, I agree. Nothing wrong with radical ideas, but I think also there's a level of realism as well that's needed if you actually want to change. So, yes. Hold on, do we need to use the mic for questions for the audience? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Paris, and thank you for your wonderful question. So I was wondering, you talk a lot about cars and technology. I'm really curious if you could talk about the relationship between transportation and access to the natural world. In North America, especially where I'm also from, it's literally impossible to find beautiful natural spaces if you don't have a car. And that sort of paralleled the denigration of walkable cities and access to nature in cities. And I was just wondering if you could touch on that because I haven't heard a lot of that in the conversation. I think it's an interesting thought.
Absolutely. I think it's an interesting question as well, right? Especially when you think about, kind of the trajectory and the motivations around city building or urban planning or whatnot in North America in particular, and how there was very much this focus of getting people to go out to the suburbs, which were car dependent areas where, there really weren't other forms of transportation, but that was also where you'd have some like greenery and things like that with your front lawn. Maybe there'd be access to some kind of natural space there as well. But then the city was very much kind of left to rot, right? It was very much kind of destroyed and kind of remade to build highways through them, to build roads through them, tearing down many buildings to create parking lots and things like that. So really kind of taking away any kind of natural space in many cases, or at least reducing the kind of space that was given over to that. And then on top of it, the real kind of lack of focus we've had for several decades, at least now, on public spaces and how we've increasingly given over public spaces to the private sector and how that has kind of reshaped them. And so, I think that access to nature is really essential. And certainly, I think that cities, I'm kind of a pro cities person. I know there's some people who don't like cities, who would like to see us go back to more kind of a rural kind of communal living. That's not my take on things. But I think that there needs to be more of not only the nature kind of brought into cities so that people can have those experiences and have those connections, but also to ensure that, as you say, you can reach nature without needing to own a car, right? So that those kind of connections are also created. I remember when I was in Sydney, in Australia, they had kind of, just a random example, I don't know why it came to mind. But they had a train line that went right out to the Blue Mountains, right? And so there was always that connection there. You could always kind of reach it in that way. And a lot of people took advantage of it to go kind of hiking or whatnot on the weekends and stuff. And so, yeah, I think it's so important that connection is there. Hope that answers your question.
I was just thinking, like, in the US, the national park system is designed and was built for cars. Like, you can't go to many national parks. Like, they're specifically designed to be interacted with through a car. And I don't think we should not repeat the national parks, but obviously that's an issue for parks and culture.
No, absolutely.
Something you mentioned in the book that I thought was interesting, kind of linked to this, was again going back to this idea of freedom and individualization around, having your own garden, having your own swimming pool, having your own cinema, and reducing parks in cities, and actually, and reducing public swimming pools and public baths and so on and so forth, and this focus on like, well, I can just have my own, and therefore we don't. What was it? Radical. You cited it. I wrote down his name. Arvin Vincent, who talks about getting rid of reversing the trend of private luxuries by a campaign of public abundance. This is going to deal with stuff, but with respect to gardens and parks, I think there's something there. If you are talking about cities specifically,
absolutely,
is a way of engaging with that question. Let's go to the audience and see who else wants to ask a question. Yes,
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I haven't read your book yet, but it's going to be teaching material for the course Data Design in the City that I'm completing next semester. Anyway, so I wanted to ask whether you have any sort of practical recommendations in terms of policy shaping. So policy regulates transportation and corporate interests will need to adhere to what the government said, supposedly. So that's one question. And question two, or recommendation, did you visit the Madelvik factory here in Edinburgh?
No, I didn't.
Electric car factory from the late 1800s.
Oh, fascinating.
Things could be otherwise in Edinburgh some 100 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Not Edinburgh specifically, but it is fascinating when you look back at like the late 1800s and how, obviously we think about the car and kind of, the fossil fuel car just going back, far in time. But in that moment, there was not just the electric car, but also the steam engine car. And there was kind of a competition, like which one is going to win out, which one is going to dominate the future of transportation. And for a while, it actually looks like the electric car is going to take over. But then the internal combustion engine vehicle is kind of produced in a more efficient fashion, so that the price comes down. It's much more easier for people to access, and then of course it's taken up in the war effort, and benefits a lot from the scale that comes with that. Yeah, so fascinating. Question on policy. I think it's fair to say I discuss policy a lot in kind of the end of the book, and some of the things that we should be thinking about and doing. And I want to pick up on a point that Gemma made, is that often what gets in the way of adopting these policies that would have socially beneficial effects is the power of corporations, right? They have really shaped the transport system for the past century or more. And I argue that Silicon Valley was really trying, or is still trying, to shape it into the future, right? To ensure that not only can certain interests who have already benefited from the transport system as it is, who profit from how it is, would continue, but then they would be able to take their cut as well, right? As we can see from their proposals, but even now, as some of those proposals are rolled back, there's still the kind of remaking of the car along technological lines so that they are connected to the internet, so that they're sharing all this data on you and all these sorts of things. So they're still kind of finding a way in there. It's not really addressing your question, but I would argue that there are many kind of policy tools that governments can take in order to try to transform the way that we get around, in order to address these problems. They're multiple, whether that's investing in public transportation, whether that's investing in cycling infrastructure so that people can feel they can get around safely, so that they can park and store their bikes safely and know that they're not going to get stolen. We saw the success of policies like that in Paris during the pandemic in particular, or the early part of the pandemic, as they really kind of expanded cycle lanes really quickly, and now a lot of people get around on bikes a lot more than did previously, right? Just to give one small example. So there are many things that can be taken. And one final point I would make is that when we think about transportation for cities, transportation is not a system that is kind of exists on its own, right? It's connected to everything else that happens in the city as well, whether it's natural spaces, whether it's housing. And so if we take the policy choices to improve transportation by investing in public transit and cycling infrastructure and things like that, we also need to think about what effect that's going to have on the housing system. And if you're just going to see housing prices rise around those investments, then the people who would benefit most wouldn't be able to access it. And then that forces us to reconsider whether it makes so much sense to privatize so much of the housing system, and to leave so much of it in the hands of private companies, and whether we need to start to reconsider those things as well. So yeah, big answer, but it's also a big topic.
One policy recommendation that I'm actually fascinated, which is not specific to transport, but more about delivery of public services. You're saying we should hand over more to the post office. And I thought that was a lovely, it's such a simple idea, really. And it's also a historical idea in a lot of ways, particularly in the UK. But, I was thinking about that as again, this kind of reimagining what it is we're talking about when we talk about making policies or talking about public service or so on and so forth. It's not just a case of like, we have a bus system, let's make sure that they have Wi-Fi or whatever. It's like, actually, what does it mean to deliver something to people?
Totally. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? I've got plenty here, so don't worry if you don't extend, but I just want to give you guys. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that great conversation. I just wanted to ask about, so you mentioned kind of the power of corporations in terms of shaping like policy and things, but I just wanted to get your perspective on so you touched on kind of support and just like people's attitudes, and I think even if people are uncomfortable with cars and the way of the sort of transport system at the moment, there's definitely a kind of attachment to that kind of privacy and the sort of not safety, but that kind of perception that of individualism is kind of, it works for me. How do you sort of go about breaking that down, I guess, and challenging that? Is it through policy? Does policy change that, or do you need to kind of confront that to drive policy?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's a mixture, right? There's many things that are going on there. It's a policy issue, but it's also just kind of the, how do we think about the city? How do we interact with the city kind of question, especially when you think about how, as we've been talking about, so much of kind of the public space or the space that people could inhabit otherwise has been removed or revoked or paved over or whatnot, right? So that it does make sense, people, I'm sure it happens here, but in the United States and Canada might kind of take a break at work and go out to their car to sit in it because it's like their little space that they have, right? And it makes perfect sense when there's so few other spaces that you can go to, that you can inhabit, that you can spend time in. And so I think that there are multiple things, right? I think on one hand, it's a policy problem where you need to actually address that. You need to ensure that those spaces are there for people so that, you know, they have some alternative. But then there's also kind of the, how do we position the transport system? How do we position cities? How do we allow people to think about them in a different way? Because as I was saying, you know, for many people, their whole lives, you know, all they've known is the car. They constantly see ads for the car on TV and the newspaper, wherever else. So, you know, everything they know is kind of wrapped up in the automobile. And that does take, you know, time. It does take effort to challenge that, to get people to think differently. But as I said, again, I think that there's also a growing recognition that there are problems with the system as it exists today, whether it is that you don't have a car and you're relying on like a very kind of poor public transit system that is expensive, that isn't reliable, that isn't kind of giving you the frequency that you need so that you can rely on it. Or, you know, you do have a car, you do get around with a car, but you're spending a lot more time stuck in traffic. You're spending a lot more money in order to get around in that way. Maybe you know people who've been injured or who have died because they've been hit by a car. So there are many issues there that I think can be kind of seized on, that can be used to kind of get people into a broader conversation around it. And I think that's part of the way to do it.
So I'm just going to add something on that one as well, because I think it's not to just tear down people's perceptions of the world and make them feel negative, but the very idea of like the car giving you freedom, like saying actually it doesn't really, you know, or, you know, focusing on yourself and the individual might feel like the right thing to do, but actually it's not. And for instance, we're seeing this questioned a lot in kind of self-care conversation, right? Like this, oh, you know, things would be better if we all focus on our self-care. It's like, hang on a second, what about like collective change? Or like, you know, doesn't that just put the onus on individuals as opposed to social change and so on and so forth? So it's, you know, that can be a difficult thing to engage people on because it can be quite negative and it can make people feel more vulnerable perhaps than they already do. But I think positioning the reality of what we have and presenting where these ideas come from in the first place, as you said, is maybe one step towards then going, maybe I can get a feeling of freedom or privacy or a sense of self in other ways. It doesn't have to be like this. That would be what I think. Anything more from the audience? Yes.
Hi, so thank you very much. I'm really sorry if this isn't the book, I haven't read it yet. You seem to be sidestepping a lot around bikes and push bikes and e-bikes as options. It's like the original thing with bikes was it's freedom and then it was co-opted by power. Did you tell loads about that, but now about bikes? Well, is there a reason about that?
I just haven't asked.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. Yeah, I definitely talk about bikes. I would admit I am kind of a public transit lover. You know, I love the buses. I love subways and metro systems in particular. But yeah, I think that bikes are really key, right? Especially when we're thinking about taking more trips away from cars. I'm sure it's the case in the UK, but in North America, like the vast majority of trips that people take are actually quite short, right? You really don't need a car for them in many cases. And so I think that the bicycle is an important kind of means to get people to move away from that. But I think that the e-bike is particularly important in that, especially when we think about North America and kind of how so much has been built for the car and has those kind of distances built into it, that there's a lot of opportunity there to use the e-bike. I know right now in the United States, e-bikes are outselling electric cars. No surprise, they're much cheaper, but they're also very useful, right? They do allow people to think about mobility in a different way. And I think that especially when you pair that, you know, especially if you subsidize it, try to make it easier for people to obtain a bike or an e-bike or something like that, but then pair it with the public policy so that you have dedicated bike lanes so that people don't feel that they're going to get hit by a car when they're driving them, so that you have the storage spaces there for the bikes so that people know they can store them and it's not going to get stolen while you're in the shop or something like that. Having those pieces there is really essential to making people feel more dependent on that mode of transportation to feel that they can take it instead of the car. But then I think another piece of it is also to have the education there, right? To have opportunities for people to give it a try, right? To talk to people who've used it before, to think about how it could fit within their mobility patterns, right? I think that that's a piece of it that maybe we don't even talk enough about it. Maybe I don't talk enough about it in the book, but I think it's really important too.
One thing that you do talk about in the book that you didn't mention with respect to that I found really fascinating, and maybe you'll also benefit from it if and when you read it, was you talked about the role of Silicon Valley and all their concoctions of plans and how it's actually replacing the use of the bike. So things like short trips and Uber, the demographic of the type of people that are doing this are also a big part of the demographic of people that would cycle a bike for that trip. The same with the scooters, the same, so this idea of like the bike is almost the thumb's option, but it's being replaced by this high-tech vision that's not letting people, it's almost clouding people's default, which would be I should just cycle. And I think that's also quite a powerful message that we're saying around this idea of vision and the idea of what we're putting forward as what transport should be. I would argue though, I think nowadays bikes are of course getting a lot more support.
And just to pick up on what you're saying, like I think part of the problem there is that if you think about the bike, it's not super like profitable, right? You'll buy a bike for, I don't know what, a few £100, maybe not even that much, an e-bike a little bit more, then you can use it for years. You might need to get a little bit of maintenance every now and then, but it's gonna last you, right? And so that's not a really profitable industry to be in if you're looking for a means to make money. And that's why we saw when the time when Silicon Valley was interested in bikes and scooters and things like that, it was about creating this model where you had to pay every time you used it, and the bikes and scooters were littered everywhere. And for many people, that was not, the best way to interact with those services. Certainly, it made it easy to give it a shot. Will I like taking this e-bike? Will I like taking this e-scooter? Use it a few times on one of these apps, and maybe I'll get a feel for it. But then if so, I'm just going to go buy my own. It's way cheaper to do that, right?
I think that also comes back to, I'm going to steal this question here, but it's something we didn't speak about that I think is really fascinating. Bring it back to the tech and talking about technology and not being anti-technology, shall we say. We were talking earlier about how when we talk about money, there's money in tech. What do we really mean by that? There's not actually, it's not the VCs themselves that have money, although they're paid well, it's the people that fund the VCs. And they're not necessarily interested really in what the VCs put the money in. They're interested in getting money. So I would argue that a lot of people that have money that goes into tech don't actually care about tech, have no interest or their knowledge or conception of the true value that technology has, other than the fact of the short-term speculative value. And so when we kind of are starting to think about, well, what do we mean when we're talking about technology with respect to transport? Well, a bike is a technology. And so that was another thing that I sort of enjoyed about what you were writing about, sort of difference between tech and technology. And we've seen this kind of digital tech versus actual technologies being talked about a lot more recently. But sort of bringing it back to what is tech if not a speculative asset class or whatever? Like, what actually is this stuff? What does it allow us to do if we're looking at it through the perspective of what do we want as a society?
Yeah, especially when we think about digital technologies, right? And how that is, when we talk about technology today, often it means digital technology. Certainly, maybe sometimes we talk about things like nuclear or other things that these people are interested in. But generally, if we're talking about tech or technology, it is digital technology, even though that is a word that encompasses so many other things in society, right? And in particular, like when I kind of reflect on that in the book and I talk about it and I think about it, I write about the work of Ursula K. Le Guin, who's a science fiction author who I love.
She's referenced a lot in this book.
Yeah, I always try to fit it in, and yeah, I just love her work, and I find it, like, especially when we're thinking about imagination and like things that open people's mind. Like, I find her work really does that, right? It really makes you think about things in a different way. And so when she writes about technology, she writes about the mundane technologies, right? How there are a lot of people, especially in various industries, who are interested in these technologies that, take a lot of work, that encompass these massive kind of technological systems. But actually, society is very dependent on these mundane technologies that we take for granted and that we don't think about so much, and that probably aren't as profitable as some of these kind of big technological systems, right? And that maybe we need to refocus on that a little bit more, to think about the broader definition of technology rather than just, what Silicon Valley wants us to think technology is and what they benefit from having us think technology is. And so that's really kind of inspiring to me.
I think that's a lovely note to end on. I'm looking at Lighthouse. We only have an hour, right? I've forgotten the length of time that we have for this event. Is that they're not like here?
I think it was an hour. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think what's inspired you is a lovely note to end on. So please, everybody, join me in giving Paris a huge round of applause. Very good. From Lighthouse, preferably, and our other independent bookstores are awesome. I love them.
Thanks, everyone.